Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Ask the Unfaithful. My name is Sam. I am thrilled that you are joining us today. As always, I am accompanied by my counterpart and rock star, James Anir. So, my good brother, how are you on this beautiful Monday afternoon?
Fantastic. Sam, all is good. Looking forward to doing this with you. And I've got new lights, so that's why if I'm shining, that's why very shiny.
Awesome. It's raining here in Austin, so it is not a bazillion degrees, which I am thrilled about, that's for sure. For those of you watching and listening, I mean, I feel the email, so does James. I mean, we have people from all over the world who are wanting one-on-one help or couples help. And let me just say, we are so thankful that you would reach out to us. We do answer our own email. Nobody's getting rich here, so we haven't been able to hire an assistant to answer our email. We'll just do it ourselves because we're those kind of guys. So if you haven't gotten an answer from us for a few days, our apologies, we're doing our best. If you sent us an email, as long as the Gettysburg address, and you haven't gotten an answer,
Yeah,
perhaps it's the length of your email because we just don't have time to go through email of that length. So please don't hesitate to email us if you're looking for help or direction or guidance or want to do an intensive or want to do coaching or what have you. But please understand the parameters of there's only so much that we can do. So today's discussion I think is going to be extremely helpful for the unfaithful, but it's also going to be helpful for the betrayed that are listening and watching because these are some metrics that you can use to say, look, this is painful, this is hurtful, this is at the very least difficult for us communicatively, and we've got to make some adjustments. Today's discussion is five communication mistakes the unfaithful make. So before we jump into it, and before we give them the five communication mistakes the unfaithful make, say a little bit about communication. Say a little bit about we unfaithful don't really communicate great, right?
we tend not to. Very often we under communicate, if anything, although one of our points is going to be sort of the opposite of that. We also just are not really used to doing it, especially in a healthy way. So, if we look at what communication kind of means, and this is Sharon and my definition of this, and it's a little academic maybe, but it's the exchange of facts and thoughts and feelings, so that we can hear and be heard, and that's really the in a nutshell part. But healthy conversations are about expression and information.
I love what you said. I love what you said. Hear and be heard.
Mhm.
Reciprocity, equality,
Yes,
being able to hear your partner. And then there's nothing wrong with also wanting to be heard. But when we get out of balance, it is for those of us dealing with healing from infidelity or addiction, when it gets out of balance, it can be so much more harder than the average couple out there not dealing with infidelity or addiction, right?
absolutely. I mean, what we're going to talk about today could easily apply to people who are not dealing with addiction, with betrayal, with any of the stuff that we typically surround our conversations about. And it's really really important for the audience that really tunes into us, because there is a lot of stuff surrounding how we're heard, how we put things out there, how we hear things differently than maybe they're being presented. And so this today we're going to really work on that, right? We're going to work on how can each party be heard, for what they are really wanting to say. And so those healthy expressions of feelings, the healthy way of exchanging information is what we're going to be focusing on. Specifically, communication is not about trying to change the other person's mind. And I think that's
Right.
huge here.
It's vital. I think it's absolutely vital because if a betrayed thinks that their unfaithful is trying to change their mind, their defenses come up, they're ready to scratch, claw, defend, whatever, and rightly so. But oftentimes we unfaithful if we feel like our betrayed is trying to change our mind about what we feel or think or experienced or what have you, the claws come out in us as well,
Yep.
unless we're just BSing and talking out of our butt, which we kind of are good at doing sometimes,
We are.
right?
But that can also be an attempt to at least deflect, if not change our partner's mind, right? We
Absolutely.
do a lot of that trying to sort of shuck and jive, trying to get the attention off of what really needs to be talked about, right?
Amen, brother. Absolutely.
And part of that, right? Part of that is trying to deliberately change the other person's mind, trying to argue the point, lawyer it, and that sort of thing. So unfortunately, that trying to change people's mind has to be at the forefront of, am I doing that, right? As
Yeah.
I'm talking to my partner, or or even if I'm partner talking to the unfaithful, am I trying to do that, or is this a healthy conversation?
Yeah. I think it's brilliantly said. And there's so much out there on communication, and there's a million TikToks and there's a million Instagrams and all of that. But what are some of the issues in the bedrock of communication that give rise to poor communication between the unfaithful and the betrayed?
So I think the first thing we kind of touched on, we hear things through our own filters, right? Each of us, even you and me, right? We have our own perceptions of things, and so when we hear something, it runs through those filters and may land very differently from what the other person wants is trying to get across. So we have to become really aware of what are our filters here, and communication really helps us because then we're getting, and I'm going to make an emphasis here, and I'll probably make it later, on context, right? Context is king here. Context is really important because that, if we have the context, then that can change our perception. And if we change our perception is basically our reality, right? If we can change our perception, or at least see the other person's perception, then we're going to understand what they're trying to say so much better. So basically, how one person intends to communicate can often be heard through those filters, and also can hit a button.
Well, what about context? So is it in this type of dynamic, is it context, meaning an unfaithful might rattle something off that sounds fine outside of the context that there's been multiple affairs and multiple disclosures? And so is it that type of context, or what, when you say context, how is it king?
Basically, we have to understand what is being communicated, and what it surrounds, or why it's being communicated. So if I'm saying to you that I'm feeling overwhelmed, you don't know by what.
Right.
So I'm going to have to really talk to you and let you know what is overwhelming me.
Yeah.
So, and we'll get into that in the
That's great.
antidote portion, right? In answer to your question, that's really what we're looking for. Because without that context, all I know is that you're overwhelmed, or all you know is that I'm overwhelmed, right? And that's okay. You can run with that and be you know helpful with that, and try not to overwhelm me anymore, right? But if you know what the context of that overwhelm is, it might have nothing to do with you. I might just be expressing it to you.
And it needs to be said that we unfaithful sometimes, when we are unsafe, unhealthy, maybe regressed, we will say things to deliberately push buttons sometimes. And maybe even the betrayed will sometimes say things to push buttons. Isn't that humanity?
Well, yeah, everybody regresses. In the face of something that could be painful, we regress into childhood defense and basically go into a childhood state. Or so then you end up with two kids sort of duking it out in the playground.
Yeah.
And that's something we really want to avoid doing. So there can be deliberate pushing of buttons, but there can also be buttons that get pushed without any intent there to do that.
Absolutely.
And that can be the filters. It can also be something that's said without regard to the other person's filters or personality. So you really want to be able to, if you want what you're saying to land, you really
Yes.
want to be aware of what their perception, what the other person's perceptions are, and we'll get to kind of how to do that in a little bit. Certainly,
I
if the
know.
button is pushed, the person who's receiving the statement or the communication can react, and things just evolve from there, right?
One thing I know, I've seen this on Instagram, and I tell this to clients all the time. I've seen this meme makes its way around every 6 to 8 months or something, but it says this: knowing your partner's trauma is a love language. So
Oh,
when you know your partner's trauma, their childhood trauma or what's happened to them, knowing that, can't that be a compass to help you communicate with them, to know that if you even closely come to this type of communication, it's going to wound them, it's going to flood them, it's going to cause them to go sideways. And the last thing that we want to do as unfaithful is that when we know their trauma, we can be gracious, we can be kind, we can actually be, God forbid that this happens, but we could be empathetic and we could actually communicate well as unfaithful, right?
yes. And also, you've got to bear in mind that that doesn't mean that you can't discuss difficult things or things that might be painful for the other person. Yeah, you can. You can do things like preface it with, I know this is a difficult conversation to have,
Yes.
and I would really like to talk about this. Is now a good time? That kind of thing, right? So,
Or even just saying, listen, I'm not alleging that this is what you were trying to do, but I am saying that I felt X, Y, and Z. And I don't know, you know, Gabor Mate says we can choose victimhood or we can choose vulnerability. And vulnerability is, honey, I just want to be vulnerable. I don't know how to say this to you, so I'm going to say it, but I certainly don't want to allege or this or that, because that's empathy and that's kindness and that's vulnerability, not victimhood. And anytime we make ourselves victims as unfaithful, we lose, right?
mhm. Yes, absolutely. Everybody loses because
Well said.
we're defending and we're disconnected, and there is
Well
no
said.
communication in that.
All right, so let's jump into the 5 mistakes. And I think that these are universal to unfaithful and betrayed, but also just communication in general. And so let's have you launch out with them. What's number one?
So number one is making assumptions. So
Hmm. Yeah, I chuckle because I've never done that. I'm probably not going to relate to these 5 at all, James, but it's fun to hear about other people's struggles.
okay, so I can definitely relate. So you can just make fun of me, right? 'Cause
Okay, great. Yeah.
definitely, these come a lot from my own experience. So making assumptions, we kind of assume we can make assumptions that somebody understands what we're trying to say. We generally, well, we generally generalize our own experience, our own understanding to everybody else. So that's part of the assumption. But also there's an assumption that the person knows what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and so on. We also can make assumptions thus then that the other person's a mind reader,
Yeah.
assuming that you understand what the other person is saying without even hearing it. So that can look like preparing an answer in your head while the other person's talking. Because trust
And
me, when you're doing that, you are not listening.
well, right, because then we're seeing it from one-sided. And as long as we think, well, it's this, it's this, it's this, you were trying to do this, you wanted to do this, we're implying intent. A therapist I know, she calls it psychological imperialism. When we assign intent
Oh, I
to
like it.
other people's actions, it's psychological imperialism. When we are assigning intent to other people's actions, even communication, we miss it, right?
Yeah. So there's this saying, Herbert Spencer, who was not a delightful person,
That's awesome.
attempt without prior investigation.
Mm.
Right. So that's basically holding that in judgment, what she's talking about, that imperialism, right? Just saying, okay, yeah, they did this because of that. And then, that's an assumption and thus a judgment. And, then we're just holding them in disregard or really, it's a hard word, but contempt.
Yeah. And when we're into contempt, nobody wins. And you can get out, like the Gottmans call it, negative sentiment override. And you can get out of that, but it's so much harder because the contempt And let me just tell you, when you're dealing with infidelity or addiction, man, the contempt is so heavy, and understandably so. But as long as we fall into contemptuous communication and tactics, nobody's going to heal. We're going to stay stuck. So what's number two?
Avoiding the conversation. So we've talked about avoiding before, lying, minimizing, reducing, whining, deflecting, distracting, and so on. We're talking about direct communication here, right? So we're going to just kind of contain this to avoiding the conversation itself. Now you can still
Yeah,
use all of those other things in order to avoid the
sure.
conversation. The opposite of avoiding the conversation is what you were talking about before, that vulnerability piece, and that is connecting. So hopefully people are starting to connect the dots as far as what Gabor Mate is saying as far as vulnerability versus victimhood, right? So if I'm being vulnerable, I'm actually connecting.
Yeah.
If I'm not connecting, we're going to go and say, well, we're being a victim at that point. What am I avoiding? And why am I avoiding it? It's a really good question. The deal would be if we go, okay, vulnerability is V for victory, right? We're going in vulnerability, we're going in that way, then we're not going to avoid. So
Right.
the conversation. Now that doesn't mean it takes away the desire to avoid or the wish to avoid or wishing we didn't have to have this conversation. Absolutely, that can be there. Then we have to decide, override
Yeah.
that part of it so that the conversation takes place. Avoiding the conversation actually creates so much more stress anyway, because we know it has to be had at some point. So now I like this idea of a backpack. By the time we're adults, we've got a backpack with 100 pounds full of rocks and boulders and pebbles. And our job now is to take those out, not put any more in. When we avoid the conversation, we're putting more in. So it's
Yeah.
weighing us down even more. And, it's kind of like going, we know we have this task to do, and then we watch TV all day.
Yes.
The TV watching isn't necessarily that enjoyable because it's sitting in the back of our head that we didn't do that thing, right? So I think that's a pretty simple one, not easy to do, but we have to work on our own internal conversation then say, okay, we've got to do this. We've got to go towards this.
Awesome. Avoidance never helps any couple trying to heal from major trauma. It never helps an individual heal from major trauma or any trauma in general. So what's the next one? Number three.
So this is the one that's kind of opposite of what you might think, right? It's overtelling.
Mm,
So let me be really clear here. This is not holding back on truth. It's not saying,
thank
oh,
you.
I'm telling too much truth. Overtelling is just kind of overwhelming the listener with so much information that that then the real result is that the talker or the person communicating is not going to be heard because there's going to be this list of 10, 20 things. Now, we talked about undertelling, where that kind of goes into the avoiding, or the really not examining things and reducing it down to 2 out of the 10 things. And we've talked about this a little before in terms of communication. Most human beings are really good with 3 things. So if we can just kind of go, okay, these are the 3 important things that I need to communicate, and that's 3 things at a time. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that, okay, you got to ignore, you got to swallow those other 7 things, right?
I love that because every betrayed is like, hold on here, wait a minute. I only get to ask 3
That's it.
questions or what have you. James, I'm sending you some anthrax right now. But would it
So,
be, is it fair that maybe couples who are out there stuck where they feel like, James, Sam, we cannot seem to get on the same page, our communication spirals, would it be healthy to say, look, each of you bring 3 points, 3 points only? Now that makes 6, but still maybe it's a 3 point, or maybe if they're really struggling in a negative sentiment override, maybe whoever brings the conversation up has 3 points and you only talk about those 3 points for 30 minutes and cap it. Because there's got to be a way to get out of this paralysis where every time they have a conversation, it just goes sideways, right?
right. So I do like that idea. Time limited, topic limited, or point limited, right? So 3 points agreed upon, of course, that's going to be how you approach it. The other thing that we do is when one person starts to tune out the other person, that's when they need to be, and this needs to be agreed upon too, they need to say, okay, time, not like that, because that could be pretty rude, but to say, I'm really having trouble hearing you right now, and that is what is most important to me. I need to.
So
Mhm.
that's great. Now at that point, because we both know some people listen looking for opportunities to shut their betrayed down sometimes, or even they're unfaithful. So at that point, is it, okay, hold on, I'm having trouble hearing you. And then at that point, they recenter themselves, they take a
Yeah,
moment, glass of water. What is it?
right. So it can be something as simple as a glass of water, ice water, holding a piece of ice in your hand, preferably around a cloth so you don't burn your skin, please. Something to kind of bring them back into this reality rather than the area that they've been going off into, which causes them not to listen. Now, the
Excellent.
other part that can be done is to say, I need to take X amount of time and go and grow myself back up, to use a John Lee quote.
Awesome.
I know I've talked about this before, but it's really effective. The deal here is that whoever is taking the break needs to put a time limit on that break. And so that they come back before that time is up, and the person that is waiting for them, possibly stewing, because that can happen, is knows that they're going to do that. And by golly, be on time, right? Don't be early even,
Yeah.
but don't be late, because certainly for an unfaithful to be late, that would reinforce that part where they're not trustworthy.
Okay. The thing that I get a lot of feedback from clients or listeners is how practical we can be. So I love all of that. And I think practical is always a game changer in many ways.
Yeah.
So what's number 4?
So number 4 is reading and reacting. This kind of goes with the making assumptions piece, because as soon as somebody comes in a room, you actually have something called neuroception. And neuroception is where, so we have perception, right? But perception is where we already have thought going through our head, and we're running it through a filter and going, that must be because, etc.
Right.
Whereas neuroception, we're actually picking up on things, our body is picking up on them. So our paravagal system mostly is picking up
Yeah.
on what's happening in the environment. If somebody walks into the room, they kind of almost can feel like the mood coming off of them, right? You
Hmm.
don't necessarily have to see that person. And I know I'm sounding a little bit new agey and esoteric here,
No,
but it really is
it's
real.
example. It's an example where sometimes couples will be in session and they'll be sitting so close together and they just start to just spiral, right? Sometimes you have to kind of have them sit in separate chairs or put some type of divider between them. So it's like, hey, let's not take on each other's energy. Let's create some space so that we can be our own person and stay grounded. Is that fair?
Or couple, yeah, or couples that are sitting together and then suddenly one is leaning away from the other. I mean, that's definitely, it's not all about what energy they're feeling off of this person, but it's partly, right? And the
Yeah,
other part will
absolutely.
be informed by whatever their past interactions are. So neuroception comes into it. So we might turn around, and then we're looking for physical cues. How's the person walking? What's the tilt of their head? What are their eyes doing? All these things that we're not actually conscious of, but we're reading. Like, we're very good. Humans are very, very good at reading other people's body language, especially, and then react to that. So
Yeah,
basically, if somebody's in a poor mood, I might change what I do, or what truth I'm willing to tell, or what I'm really going to go into a conversation about,
absolutely.
in order not to get a really bad reaction out of them. Or I might do something preemptive in order to get a good reaction.
Yeah.
The idea is, though, this is about reading and reacting. We read the mood and then react, and then it's not an honest conversation anymore.
Now we're just trying to keep everybody from flooding, or we're just trying to keep them happy or just
Right.
please them. And now we start a cycle that's already excuse me, been going on? Okay, number 5, because I want the listener and viewer to know we're going to talk about antidotes and help for all of these, but let's get through the number 5 one, which is that.
Okay, so that would be lack of clarity.
Hmm.
So we talked about, too much information. That's a bit TMI, right? So just this list and list is what I'm saying. Just so many things the other person can't take in. Okay, we've talked about that. Then there's the lack of clarity, like saying something that the other person's not necessarily going to hear. So I had this habit years ago of saying things 3 different ways. And that was in order to make sure that what I was saying was going to land. And that resulted really from not being heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
It might have resulted a bit from me not being the clearest person in the world and expressing what I needed to express. We're talking even when I was a kid.
Mm.
So, kid, young adult, well, pretty much till last year. I'm kidding. uh,
Okay.
the
Okay.
lack of clarity. So the listener has to be able to identify what is being said for the communication to be valuable at all.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just not heard, and the other person's going or reacting poorly because then they're confused and they don't like that, they can't understand what you're trying to say.
And we just get lost because we continue to, now we're not even talking about the thing, we're talking about the secondary, tertiary, we're all over the mark. And now how many couples probably can go, yes, we started talking about this night or this incident, and now we're off into childhood, or now we're off into 17 years ago, and now we're off into this, and we're spiraling, when it's understandable and normal, but it doesn't have to be that way. And we unfaithful don't have to make these 5 mistakes. We actually can get better at communicating, and we can actually do some work that makes us pretty masterful communicators that display empathy and kindness, that hear our partner, but also feel heard. So, as we talked about, now, what are some of the antidotes that can really help minimize mistakes, help us be great communicators, and help our betrayeds be like, wow, you did that really well?
Let's go with that last statement, that the listener must be able to identify what's being
Mm-hmm.
communicated for the communication to be valuable. When we present, we have to do it in a considered way, right? So when I say 3 bullet points, you can even write them down to remind yourself, what you're really wanting to say. But being
Right.
considered about it means thinking about what I want to say, how it's going to land, how can I be clear. That's really the foundation of good communication. That is basically given as intended and received as such. In order to do that, we have to be clear. So why? Because you want to be heard. So make
Yeah.
sure that you're very clear about what you're communicating. Is it facts? Feelings? Are you just thinking out loud? Are you dreaming? Like dreaming about, hey, this is what I would love for our relationship to look like. If
And
you're
I
clear
love,
about that, mhm,
absolutely. And for some couples, I tell them, dude, show up to a conversation with a pen and take notes. If you want your betrayed to actually kind of go, maybe he or she is actually listening, show up with a pen and paper and take notes on what they're saying. Not because you're trying to build an argument against them or poke
right?
holes in their argument, but because you love and you care about them and you want this to be important, and you want them to feel important because you're able to go, okay, so you want me to be kind when I communicate. All right, you want me to check in. You being able to do that shows respect and empathy, right, when the heart behind it is obviously right.
Yes, and I think that's the real point there of this is your heart has to be in that because that really can look like, okay, I'm making notes in order to be able to argue this point. And it can't be about that. So I think some communication, like, would it be okay if I wrote this down because it's really important to me to remember, you know?
Excellent.
And you're absolutely right. It's great, and it's amazing though. If we keep it to 3, we really don't necessarily have to write that down because we are really capable. Most human beings, most are really capable of these three things. Really, I mean, the studies show it's about seven, but that could be pretty challenging. So three
Yeah, you're
is
not going to have
three is
this guy
fine.
remember seven. If you give me three, I'm probably going to remember it for a variety of reasons. Strike one, strike two, strike three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I
Right?
mean, you can, their
Well,
threes are powerful. So,
threes are very powerful and they keep it simple. When you present what you need to say in that very considered way, it's going to get across much better. So be sure you can even say, look, I just want to say these I'm communicating facts right now, right? Or I'm communicating my feelings right now. This has nothing to do with
yes.
facts. Or hey, you know what? I just am thinking out loud. Can you go with me on this? Or hey, I'm just dreaming that this might be fun to do. You don't have to make it happen. Or even adding, I'd like some help coming up with a solution about this.
Mm,
That is
I
really
like it.
important. So that actually goes to another one of those mistakes that can be made, although we didn't put it in the five. These aren't necessarily the top five, right? But fixing it, solving all the time.
Gosh.
That's a big one, but we've mentioned it a lot before, so I kind of wanted to do some newer stuff. I just wanted, it's good to repeat that.
No, absolutely. Because we all try and fix it. I think you could write a book on it and how it just infuriates the betrayed because when they feel like a math problem that's just being fixed to go away, they hate that and they'd like to stab you in your face. Not that they would ever feel that type of anger. But isn't it also key that delivery is essential? Because, man, you could have some great truth, but if it's delivered in a way that's harmful or argumentative, it just goes out the window.
Yeah, you have to match the impact with your intent, right? So you've
What
really
is,
got
hold
to,
on. Match the impact with your intent. What does that mean? Because that sounds really powerful.
so, I can have this wonderful intent behind what I'm trying to say, and if I don't consider how it's going to impact Sharon, maybe she's in a very tender place, or maybe I use the wrong language, not meaning to, but I haven't really thought about it, and then it impacts
Hmm.
her in totally a different way than so. Hey, maybe we should go out to dinner this week because I really feel like we haven't been going out and enjoying ourselves or connecting that much. If she's in a bad place, right, or a very tender place, she might take that very negatively. Like, what do you mean? I mean, we've been very connected. I mean, not that she does. She really doesn't go there, but I'm trying to indicate that if I said I would love to for us just to have some one-on-one time, and really connect, and I'd love to take you out to Bimini Twist around the corner or whatever, right? Which we happen to
Mm-hmm.
really like. Then that comes across so much better. You can feel the impact of that being very positive, right?
That's great.
But we
Okay.
have
I
to
like that
really have to
principle.
think about that. Time,
I like that.
one thing I didn't really say on the last point was if you don't know what the person is trying to communicate, as far as this goes under clarity, ask. Don't
Yeah.
assume. If you're a little
Okay.
unsure, ask. That's really important because it's being misunderstood can really be a trigger for somebody, right?
It
So
sounds like it sounds like you're also talking about timing because timing is also incredibly important.
it really does. Timing matters. There's in imago therapy, which we do a bit of, there's this idea of asking for an audience or making an appointment with each other.
Mm.
When would be a good time to talk about an issue that I'm having with, and you can name the issue rather than just kind of launching into it. People do literally make an appointment. Okay, we're going to do that Friday at 7. That's fine. Absolutely. But you can also just sort of play it
Absolutely.
by ear, right? So when would be a good time to sit down and talk where, we can both have each other's full attention?
And
Notice how I said that.
if you want to score points with your betrayed, being able to say, "Hey, what is your week like this week? I'd like to schedule time to talk about X, Y, and Z to help you feel seen or heard." Man, if we the unfaithful actually initiate and prioritize an appointment time to talk, I think that would be huge. It would say we actually are showing foresight, we are thinking about this, we are prioritizing it, we are prioritizing them, being able to say, hey, I'd like to talk this week, I want to be sensitive to your schedule, right?
Yeah. And it also allows the other person, partner, to prepare themselves emotionally for that conversation. So that brings us
Great.
to another point under timing matters, and that's no ambushing. Sharon likes to tell the story of, she's a morning person. I'm apparently becoming one because of the puppy, but I've never really historically been one. So she would wake up long before I did, and she would have all of these things going on in her head. And she would sit there and watch my head, right? Watch my bald head, as she likes to say, and wait until I turned over and woke up, and then just go, and I'm just sitting there going, ah. So she likes to call
Ooh,
that ambushing. If we are not considerate of the other person's timing, of are they in a good space to do that? Some people need their coffee before they can talk about something. Then we're really going to be putting them back on their heels, and they're not going to be ready for that conversation. And that's
yeah,
really important, that both parties are ready to talk.
excellent. What are some other practical ways we can do this?
I think, you have to speak from your heart, not your head. We always talk
Yeah.
about that. This is the longest journey that we can make, is this 18 inches, right? So the next thing would be, start every sentence, as long as it's about feeling, right? But with I feel, you really actually have to follow that with a feeling word.
Yes.
I feel overwhelmed. I feel sad. I feel hurt. I feel angry. If you follow it with the word that, now you're flipping it onto the other person. So I feel that you're being irrational. That's not a feeling statement. That's a thinking statement. It's a judging statement. If I follow, I feel sad when you, or I feel scared when you, this gives the listener context. And it's important because then they know what to do with that. They know whether an apology is necessary, what to change, and so on. So feeling, I feel blank when you blank, not I feel that. Okay.
I love that. I think it's super practical. Remembering is hard, but if you both unfaithful and betrayed, if you can remember that, I think it will help you. And just being kind as you deliver that is especially helpful.
Another thing is this, we hear this statement all the time. I'm sorry that you feel that way. That is a cardinal sin of empathetic communicating.
Yes. Yes.
Why? It immediately and completely negates what the other person is feeling and has been brave and vulnerable enough to tell you. And it's a quick way to stop a real conversation in its tracks. To
And it's
get,
a quick way to just kind of one down your partner. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, you ridiculous excuse for a human being. Or I'm sorry you feel that way, that you're so stupid. You actually believe that to be true. That's what the receiving person thinks when they hear that. I'm sorry that you feel that way because you're so dumb. That's what we feel, right? When somebody
yeah.
says that.
So the person who's being vulnerable then is going to just shut up and disconnect in defense of who they are, and in defense of being attacked, basically. So do not do that.
It's a great way. You talk about this often. I think it's a wonderful statement. I actually did this with one of my kids the other day. Is you talk about the power of doing a do-over.
Yeah. So we've called it redos as well. Um, don't be afraid to ask to do that, right? If you make a mistake or something comes across poorly or hits the other person poorly, just say, "Can I have a redo, or can I do that over, like, completely? Can I have a do-over?" Because it's acknowledging, hey, I didn't say that. That landed the wrong way.
Yeah.
That was hurtful. And don't be afraid to do the amends. We've outlined that in another one. And asking for that do-over really is, and then the other person giving the grace for that, really allows the communication to continue and helps people move past any hurt or any buttons that are being pushed.
Because whether you come from faith and you felt like the Holy Spirit convicted you, or you are an atheist or an agnostic or everything in between, and you just felt like, man, I said that in a way where I feel like a real jerk face. There's an ability. I said something to my oldest the other day, and I was like, ooh, I said, hey, let me do that again. because that was really crappy and I'm sorry. And he was like, okay. And I said, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yeah, I'm good. And I go, okay. I just felt better about myself too, that I wasn't being such a jerk. So as we're about done, what are just a couple of quick ways that maybe they put this stuff into practice and they can get an idea for, ooh, this is working, or, oh, we're not working. It's time to go to an intensive, or it's time to get some coaching or whatever. What are just a couple of quick ways they can tell if it's working?
If the conversations are resulting in or are not resulting in arguments, or not resulting in people storming away, are actually creating some conversations surrounding things, then that means it's working. That doesn't mean that every conversation, even when you're practicing these things, is going to go that way. People, the buttons are still going to get pushed. People are still going to be hurt. But if you use the amends process, and if you ask for redos and do-overs, that will help bring that conversation back online. And it's really imperative to get that conversation going again if it stalls. So the way you tell is if one person's willing to ask for that, willing to make an amends for perhaps saying something in a way that was hurtful. And then there's another piece there, the curiosity piece, wanting to know more about what that person's saying. Well, I'm not quite understanding everything that you're saying, and I really want to. So can you explain that a little more to me? Or does that also mean that, when you're scared of this, that you're scared of this as well? Or when you feel unsafe about that this also makes you feel unsafe? So getting curious is a sure sign, especially to whoever's talking, that the other person is really engaged and really vested in this conversation.
Because you said it best. If they don't feel that the other partner is engaged, there is this inherent rage that starts to well up inside of us. It's just the truth. We're dealing with infidelity and addiction, both or either. And at the end of the day, I remember Rick Reynolds used to always say, it's like two burn victims. Even the wind blowing on a burn can hurt like hell. And we can be so raw in our relationships that have been affected by infidelity and addiction that if we think that we're going to wing it, if we think that we're just going to suck it up and find a way out of this on our own, we are sadly deceived. So I love today so much because of the practicality of it. And as we say goodbye, we talked about the practicality of it, but we talked just a little bit about the heart behind it. So you're I consider you one of the foremost experts in being able to check our heart, because you and I have talked for so long about so many things. And I've always loved the way that you have owned, if you said something wrong or you thought something wrong or whatever, you've always been able to go, I don't like the way I did that. What's a quick way for someone to check their heart? You do it so well. What do you do that they can, is it just being reflective? Is it just being able to be sensitive? What's a quick way for us, especially unfaithful, to check our hearts?
I think it's sensing when you've done something that hasn't sat well, and usually that will sit on you a little bit. Not all of us are really aware of that. There was a time in my life when I wasn't very aware of that, so we have to become aware of that. One of the ways that we do that is doing a check-in with ourselves at night, looking at, were there any places today where I hurt somebody else, or where something I said might not have landed well? And then
I love that.
we've done that, and we've sort of done this check-in, and then we can make a plan to fix that, either immediately if we can, but certainly the next day.
And we get off autopilot. Part of the trouble that we're in life is because of us unfaithful, just being on autopilot, just following our feelings, doing what we want to do when we want to do it, following urges and not actually investigating that. And so I love that. I think anytime we can be practical, it really, really helps the listener, the viewer, find some ground in their own life. And so, on behalf of James and I, we just want to say thank you so much for tuning in and watching and listening. If we can help, remember to send a short email to asktheunfaithful@gmail.com. Please remember, we cannot do any coaching or therapy over email. It just doesn't go well, but we'd love to point you in the right direction or see how we can help. So as always, thanks for tuning in. We'd love for you to subscribe and follow the channel as well. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.